Love them or hate them, you cannot talk about classic American cooking without talking about the casserole.
This casserole is just one of the tasty dishes you can make with Spam.
Delicious on casseroles, delicious as is.
They have a complicated reputation. In fact, a famous food critic, John Mariani, once said that casseroles were to blame for the beginning of the American cooking dark ages. But we probably all have a casserole recipe that we really love. And casseroles still remain a big part of most people's diet. So how do we get here? And what exactly is a casserole anyway? Well, they actually have a pretty interesting and long history. Like, did you know that the very first documented casserole is from the year 1250? It was baked mac and cheese, a classic. And as humble as they are now, the French were actually given credit for inventing them. In fact, the word casserole is French, meaning saucepan. And they were far from humble. They were considered pretty fancy, actually. They used a lot of expensive ingredients that took a long time to prepare with equipment and dishes that just weren't practical at the time. Humble food was stew or porridge, things that you could cook in very large quantities and over an open fire. Casseroles were pretty fancy stuff. So why the sudden change from fancy living to as humble as it gets? Well, there are lots of reasons, like ready access to easy-to-use ovens, but there are really two things that are responsible for the advent of the modern American casserole. Two companies, really, Campbell's and Pyrex. In mid-century America, Campbell's soup made creamy, complex soups, the base for most casseroles, that would otherwise take all day to make, cheap and readily accessible. And Pyrex brought this, the casserole dish. Believe it or not, there was a time when every American kitchen didn't have a Pyrex casserole dish. Weird, I know. They didn't invent it or anything, but they did make it practical and tough, perfect for any average home. That did it. With tasty, easy Campbell soup in one hand and a 9x13 Pyrex dish in the other, America began their love affair with casseroles.
And that's why your mama loved casserole. Savory, cheesy, home-cooked casserole.
Sometimes it was delicious. Sometimes it was a mess. But it was always creative, and cooks found a way to feed their whole family without spending all day at the stove or breaking the bank. It's awesome, really, and it totally makes sense why they were so popular, which is why I was so sad when I read a BuzzFeed article recently about how cooks today think that casseroles are too expensive to make. Too expensive? How? I remember casseroles when I was a kid. It was like magic. A handful of meat became a whole big, cheesy, crunchy, delicious dish with just a handful of veggies, a can of soup, and a starch. It was as cheap as it gets. So what happened? Well, the purpose and heart of casseroles got a little lost somewhere along the way. And as much as I admire all the beautiful ways you can make casseroles fancy and lovely, it was never really about looks and gourmet ingredients. It was about expense. Cheap was important. Easy was important, and using up leftovers was important. Not much else mattered. So to get back to that, let's talk about what casseroles are exactly. There aren't a lot of rules. One of those being they are baked, specifically with something cheesy or crunchy on top, sometimes both. And inside, a rich sauce. Doesn't matter what kind, rich cream, bright tomato, doesn't matter. But a rich and flavorful sauce is a must. And to soak up all that sauce, usually some sort of starch. Noodles, rice, stale bread, use your imagination. From there, it's veggies and some sort of protein, usually leftovers. That's it. With just those things, you've got a casserole. And talking about casseroles has made me hungry, so it's time to make some. And what better place to find some awesome OG casserole recipes than straight from the source? Vintage community cookbooks are packed with authentic mid-century casserole recipes. So let's make a few of my favorite. So follow me for some amazing vintage casserole recipes and celebrate our most humble dish.